In this lesson, we're just going to talk briefly about when we want to use Notification Center and when we want to use the default built-in communication methods that we have inside of Unity. Now, we've already talked about this a little bit in previous lessons, but I wanted to dedicate an entire lesson to this because it's important, because every single solution or Notification Center is great, but it's not a silver bullet. We still need to know and understand how to communicate using other methods, because Notification Center does have some blind spots and it is slightly slower than other methods. So we want to use Notification Center if we think we're going to expand the functionality. For example, you'll notice all of our notifications are very general. Game over, pause, unpause, 1 round, reset. And these are all very broad functions or broad events that many different objects need to know about. However, for the most part, they're triggered by a single object. Now, for much simpler connections, such as our GUI functionality connected to our health, since that is not a large or an event, we used a different method of connection. So again, Notification Center is great for larger events that will have an effect on multiple objects. But if you know what you're getting is only going to go between 2 objects and that's only what it's going to do, you might again use one of these other methods. Now, the next reason we want to use Notification Center is if our objects are dynamically created. For example, our enemy is dynamically created, so it's easier for it to communicate many of its settings to other objects with dynamic or with the Notification Center, because these enemies are destroyed and created on the fly, so it's a little bit more expensive or difficult to connect it up, which is why we only have a direct connection with the player object and everything else is done through the Notification Center. And again, that's because the enemy is a dynamically created and a dynamically destroyed object. So it's a little bit easier to use a loose coupling with the Notification Center than to create a bunch of direct connections with other scripts. And finally, the last criteria I use for when I want to use Notification Center is when one object needs to talk to many other objects. For example, the health needs to tell many objects that the player is dead. And we're not exactly sure how many different objects need to know the player dies. The game state needs to know, our character controller needs to know, the enemies need to know. There's a lot of different places that need to know, but this player dead has a single source. The health is responsible for this. For another example is the enemy is responsible for its own death cycle. So the enemy knows that many scripts need access to this information, but it doesn't know which scripts, and it doesn't know exactly how those scripts are going to use this information. Now, some objects are just listeners. For example, this particle death is just a listener. It is listening for an enemy to die, either through the enemy dead or an enemy killed by our player, and then it spawns the particles. Others could simply be posters. Our oil explosion is an example of this. This one only posts notifications, although some of the more complex objects, like our enemy and our health, will be both posters and observers of various notifications. So let's now briefly talk about when we do not want to use Notification Center. And the first and largest example is when communication needs to happen every frame, or it needs to happen incredibly often. You'll notice the enemy was tied to the player because the enemy always needs to know where the player is. Our simple GUI always needs to know what the current player health is. It always needs to know what the game state is to get the timer information. So for these constant connections, we use the default or the built-in methods to connect these up at the start of our game, and then we don't have to worry about the connection anymore, and we don't have to use the notification system too often, because it can get bogged down if we, for example, send 10 notifications every single frame. You're going to notice an extreme frame rate drop, and if you notice a frame rate drop with the Notification Center, you need to find a way to refactor the code to use one of the more default or one of the more tightly coupled methods that we talked about earlier in this course. Now, another situation when we wouldn't really want to use Notification Center is to access other objects on the same, or access other components or scripts on the same object. For this, Notification Center isn't really useful if that is the sole point of connection. If, for example, our enemy needed to talk to its enemy controller on, or its enemy animation on this exact same object, we wouldn't need to use Notification Center to create that connection. Because it's a one-to-one connection. And since it's on the same object, it's very easy to create that with the getComponent method. However, if you have to talk with multiple objects or multiple scripts, you still may want to use Notification Center. And finally, the last case when I do not use Notification Center is for static or constant objects that are always going to be around in our game. For example, the game state and the health are connected through the usual methods, or the game state can connect to our our health through the normal methods. And as we said before, our simple GUI is also exactly the same way. The GUI and our health and our game state are always going to be around. We're not going to be dynamically creating a new game state or destroying it. And so we can use these find methods at the beginning of our game and spend a little bit of time there so that every single other update happens much, much faster. So with that said, use Notification Center if you can see it helping your pipeline or your game development process. As said before, this definitely helped us deal with this complex script to multi-script interactions. But as I said at the beginning of this lesson, not every tool or not any tool is a silver bullet, so we still need to know how to use the default methods. So that brings us to the end of this course. As always, I hope you've enjoyed these videos, and if you have any questions, feel free to jump on our forums, where we are active participants and have hundreds of helpful members. So I can't wait to see how you use these tools and techniques in your own projects.